and welcome to my channel. I am Dr. Yvette with Prophet Speak, and today's video is going to cover Hebrews and why it was written. And then in part 2, I'm going to cover specifically Hebrews 11 and verse 1. So if this is something that you're interested in, stay tuned. Hello, Dr. Yvette here with Prophet Speak. So, as you heard from the intro, I am going to talk about why the book of Hebrews was written. And this video is just a part of my beginning research as I endeavor to teach different chapters out of the book of Hebrews. But I want to give you some background so that you understand what I know about the book of Hebrews being written. So I'm going to use the Holy Bible to kind of guide us through and some notes to kind of guide us through why the book of Hebrews was written. So let's start out. They don't really know, and when I say they, I'm talking about Bible scholars. They don't really know who wrote the book of Hebrews, but they have a few people in mind. So I'm going to tell you who those people are. And then you can just think about it, just based on the different scriptures that are in Hebrews, why you think it could have been a certain person. But when we think about the writer of Hebrews, this is who scholars can give some ideas out of the book to. So they named Paul, Apollos, Barnabas, Luke, Timothy, Aquila and Priscilla, Silas, Aristian, Philip the deacon, and Phileo of Alexandria, or out of this grouping of people who may have actually written the book. But there are things within the book of Hebrew that speaks to one person over another. And so you can kind of get your idea. In fact, type it down in the comments who you actually think may have written the book of Hebrews. And then the actual date and location. So we talk about the location is still unknown. But if we knew the author, we probably could pretty much figure out the location or where they may have been when they wrote the book. And then it is believed that it was written between somewhere between before 68 AD or after 80 AD. So there is a lot of mystery around the book of Hebrews, who wrote it, the time period, and then the actual location of where this book may have been written. But continuing on, I want to talk to you about why the book was written. So it is believed by scholars that it is written to the Jewish Christian, the Hebrew, because they were in danger of apostasy. So if you don't know what apostasy means, it is abandonment or renunciation of the religion. So these Jewish Christians are about to leave, throw in the towel, if you will, whatever you want to call it, but abandon the Christian faith. What could possibly have been going on to make them want to abandon their faith and change what they believe from Christ all the way back to Moses, is what scholars believe. And so if we take a look at that in depth, we're going to start out with what these things were. What were the conditions of their apostasy? What was making them feel like, or what was their behavior that lead us to believe that they were about to abandon the Christian faith? So it is believed in scripture, according to Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 1. So I am going to turn there so I can read it to you. So when we look at Hebrews 2 and 1, chapter 2, verse 1. So it is believed that they were going to abandon the faith because they neglected scripture. That would be so. If you're abandoning scripture, then you're definitely about to leave the faith, because scripture is the faith. So in Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 1, it says, therefore we ought to give the more earnest heed to the things which we have heard, lest any time we should let them slip. So the author is saying we need to give heed to the things that we have learned, lest we let them slip. So lest we stay in tune with the things that we have learned, we're going to lose them. So apostasy, abandoning the Christian faith because they're neglecting the scriptures. The second thing was unbelief. So if we look at Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 12, it says, "Take heed, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God." So again, in chapter 3 and verse 12, it reads, "Take heed, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God." So unbelief is another reason why they were about to abandon or renounce the faith. We find another one in Hebrews 5 in verse 12, refusal to teach each other. So if we take a look at Hebrews 5 and verse 12, it reads, "For when for the time ye ought to be teachers, ye have need that one teach you again, which be the first principle of the oracles of God, and are become such as have need of milk and not of strong meat." So look at what the author is saying. "For when for the time ye ought to be teachers, ye have need that one teach you again." So they were not teaching each other, but they also had a need for them to be taught again, and how they had pulled away from the principles of God. Okay, so let's keep going. In verses 13 and 14, we can see that they were in trouble of apostasy because of their conduct. So 13 and 14, verse 13 and 14 of that same chapter 5, "For every one of you that useth milk is unskillful in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But strong meat belongeth to them that are full of age, even those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil." And so there must have been issues with their conduct, because he's calling them babes. He's saying that they're having issues in exercising or discerning good and evil. So there had to be some conduct issues going on. He also mentioned that they're unskillful in the word of righteousness. So they are babies, some of them. And so apostasy, wanting to abandon and leave the faith because they're a babe, they're unskillful in the word of righteousness, but also they're having a difficulty discerning good and evil. Okay, so let's keep going. This one is important. Neglect of public worship. Okay, let's go to Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 25, a very familiar passage of scripture. It says, "Not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as ye see the day approaching." So, forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, abandoning coming together as a group of believers. They had gotten away from that. And so that verse 25 in chapter 10, their neglect of public worship, coming together with each other to practice the scriptures, I'm sure, because we said in, let's see, the first one, neglect of scriptures, chapter 2, verse 1. Okay, then their weakness in prayer. So we see that in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 12. Let's see what that reads. "Wherefore lift up the hands which hang down, and the feeble knees." And so the feeble knees represents their posture for prayer. And so if they're neglecting prayer, if they're neglecting worship, lift up the hands which hang down. So not worshiping. And the feeble knees, not getting down to pray, not lifting your hands to worship. So if you're not praying and you're not worshiping, then you are likely going to get into apostasy. Abandon of the faith, the things that you were taught to do. That's a part of what you believe. And then the last thing that was a condition of their apostasy is instability in their doctrine. And so that is chapter 13 and verse 9. It says, be not carried about with divers and strange doctrines. For it is a good thing that the heart be established with grace, not with meats, which have not profited them that have been occupied therein. So listen at that again. Be not carried about with divers and strange doctrines. So don't be carried away with diverse doctrines or doctrines that are strange to you. They're very different from what you have been taught. They're very different from what you have learned from Moses all the way through Christ. And so if you are hanging on to strange doctrines and diversities of doctrines, then there is a likelihood that you can get caught in apostasy, wanting to leave the faith, wanting to abandon what you have learned from Christ all the way back to Moses when God gave you the written law, and for the Levitican priesthood, the oral law and things of how they should conduct themselves. Okay, let's go a little bit further. So the argument for this epistle can be captured in two main ideas. Because remember, they are writing to Christians that are in danger of abandoning what they believe. They're in danger of renouncing their religion. And so the author is saying that scholars believe that this can be captured in two main ideas, because what they're trying to do is, one, telling this group of believers to consider Christ, and then exhort each other. So before you abandon the religion, before you leave the faith, I want you to consider Christ and the things that he has done. That's why Hebrews talks about the things that Christ had done. And I want you to exhort each other. So in order to exhort each other, remember, don't forsake the assembling of yourselves together. Study the scriptures so that you can teach other people the scriptures. Don't get into unbelief. And watch your conduct. Be able to discern good from evil. Lift your hands and worship God. Don't forget to pray. And so the author is writing, these are things that we should be able to exhort each other in as Christians. And for the Hebrew Christians, exhort each other, because you are about to renounce the religion. You're about to abandon what it is that you know about Christ and even the things that you had learned from Moses. And so the two main ideas, consider Christ and exhortation. And then authors believe the whole purpose of the letter was to inform this discouraged group of Christians and to encourage them to support both of these approaches by including innumerable examples of Christ in the book of Hebrews and of those who had successfully lived by faith. So the whole purpose of the letter is to inform those Christians, those that were about to abandon the faith, and to encourage them to support these two approaches. Consider Christ and exhort your brother. So in considering Christ, it will remind you of what Christ did for you as a Christian, as a believer in him. And then remembering what your brothers had done, the Hall of Fame of faith, what they had done in living by faith, that should exhort you to stick with and stay by the faith. Those two ideas, consider Christ and then exhort each other with knowing that there were other fellow Christians that came before you that were a part of the faith and they lived by faith successfully. Okay, one more thing that I want to bring up before we get into Hebrews 11 and verse 1. We have to look at the chapter real quickly, just one statement that precedes chapter 11. It is chapter 10, and chapter 10 addresses the failure of the Old Testament, talking about the sacrifice that the priests would give, and that this sacrifice, these sacrificial offerings failed, and then a plea to hold on to the new faith. That's what's in chapter 10. Okay, and then the author starts off, now that we know why Hebrews was written, that it was written to these Jewish Christians, these Hebrews that were about to abandon the faith and abandon the religion, and it is for them to remember Christ and for encouragement. And so he tells them in chapter 11, verse 1, now faith. So he doesn't want them to abandon their faith and what they believe. And so he's going to discuss with them about their faith and what that really means to have faith. So it says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And so the author uses the term in the Greek pistis for faith. If you're going to look it up in the Strongs, it's the 4102, pistis. And so when he says now faith, what he is saying, according to the Greek terminology of it, is faith and faithfulness, but it comes from the root word petheo, meaning to persuade or to be persuaded. Now, to be persuaded or to persuade, it is a term that supplies a core meaning for faith, which is divine persuasion. So when the author says now faith, what he is saying is now be persuaded, or now you need to have this divine persuasion. So when he says divine persuasion, he is particularly talking about being persuaded by God. So now faith represents being persuaded by God. It is this divine persuasion. But it is also believed that faith is God's warranty. So faith becomes a warranty, a guarantee that the fulfillment of the revelation that God bursts within the believer. And so the writer of Hebrews believes when he says now faith, he believes that there is a persuasion, a divine persuasion that you will have. It is God giving you a guarantee of something that he bursts in you as a believer. And so when you become saved, we actually receive this faith, because this faith is a gift. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. In fact, I may talk about that in a part 2 about what faith is and what faith is not. But when he speaks now faith, he is talking about us having this divine persuasion and receiving this warranty from God that he will fulfill the thing that he has birthed in you as a believer. Then the author goes on to say, now faith is the substance of these things that we're hoping for. And so when God gives us a measure of faith and he speaks something to us, we have to line up with God and get this guarantee from God, and it becomes this divine persuasion. And this divine persuasion is tangible. It is a substance of things that we are hoping for. So when we talk about hoping for it, It uses a Greek term, hypostasis, okay? So it comes from the word hypo, 5259, hypo, and histony, which is 2476. So it comes from a combination of two words and sort of where we get the word hypothesis from. But hypostasis, meaning under and standing under a guaranteed agreement. So the Greek word substance is hypostasis, meaning support, assurance, and a reality. So when he says, now faith, that is this divine persuasion, is the substance of things that is hoped for. So there is support and assurance and reality. We are standing under a legal term that guarantees what God reveals and what we are hoping for, we will receive. Okay? And so being under a legal, legitimate guarantee from God, we get support and assurance from the substance that we are hoping for. And so, for example, the Lord spoke to Sarah that she would have a child. We all know the story. Sarah, what? A child? I am of a high, mature age. I am not ministrating anymore. But God spoke that to her. And so Sarah had to get in faith. So Sarah had to be persuaded. There's a divine persuasion. God spoke something to her that she would have a child. And so now Sarah needs reality, assurance, and support that the thing she's hoping for, that child, will become a tangible thing. So first, the key thing is God spoke it and he told her. So her faith becomes this promise that God has given her. And so when we think about faith, it has to be something that is aligned with something that God has spoken, God has shown you, God has said. But like for Sarah, he told her, you're going to have a child. So now Sarah has to believe this promise that God has given to her that she is going to have a child. So what is she hoping for? It becomes the substance of what she's hoping for. She's hoping to receive this child that God has promised. But faith is also the evidence of things not seen. So when we talk about it being evidence, it is the Greek term 1650, elingos, meaning proof. So we need two things that have to link up with faith. Two things, substance and evidence. So these two things have to be completed in order for us to even know and believe that we have walked something out by faith. So staying with our example of Sarah, God tells Sarah that she's going to have a child. So he gives her this promise that is out there. And Sarah is hoping for that promise. And then Sarah has the child. We all know the story. God tells Sarah she's going to have the child. So she has this promise out there. This promise that she is hoping for. And then Sarah actually has the child, which we know is Isaac. So the substance and the evidence becomes this tangible thing that Sarah was promised by God, and now she believes it. So she has a word from God that is a promise. You're going to have a son. She has the son at a later date, Isaac. So promise that she's hoping for, evidence, she has the son that was unseen. And so now those two things are completed. So when we talk about faith being the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things unseen. We have a promise that God speaks to us, show us, we dream, he tells us, however it is that he speaks that thing to you that he is going to give you. He tells you it. For Sarah, it was a son. Now, she was hoping for that son. Then she has the son. So now the thing that she was hoping for becomes a substance, a tangible thing, a son. And then it becomes the evidence of that thing that was unseen, that tangible son. So when the substance of things that she was hoping for have an evidence of its proof, she has that son, faith comes together and it is birthed by God when he spoke the promise. So faith equals a promise that has a substance, and we're hoping for it, we're believing for it, and then it is a substance or a tangible thing that we have evidential proof for. So faith becomes this promise that God gives us. We're hoping for it. And then once we receive it and it comes together, there is evidence, there is proof that what God spoke and promised us, he delivered on. So in order to know what was going on with the Hebrew believer, because remember, one of the main things that they needed to consider to stay out of apostasy was the lives of other believers that lived by faith. They heard God say something. They heard God speak something. They heard God tell them something. And when he spoke that promise to them, they were hoping for it. But eventually, that substance, that tangible thing that they were hoping for had some evidential proof. Those things come together in a completeness that speaks to their faith. So I hope you have enjoyed this video. If you have, please like, subscribe, and share it with other believers that need to understand why Hebrews was written, or why the Hebrew Christians were in danger of apostasy, and then the beginning of what faith really is. So I'm going to come back to you with a part 2, and we're going to talk about those believers that live their life by faith, so that you can have other examples of when God speaks something to you and he promises something to you, that births faith within you. Thank you, and until the next time, be blessed.